On the 20th of June 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated with his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. Pictured here, you can see that Europe was very different to what it looks like today. Austria-Hungary was a multinational state and superpower in Europe at the time. Essentially, Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of this empire, and given a Serbian national was responsible for his death, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia within the month. This then caused a bunch of other countries to take sides. The German Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Kingdom of Italy all decided to take sides with Austria-Hungary, while the Russian Empire, French Republic, British Empire, and numerous other countries, including later in the war, the United States, all decided to help Serbia out. Thus, the First World War began. Being what is commonly referred to as the first of the modern wars, several different techniques were used throughout its duration. One of the most common was trench warfare. Trenches had been used throughout history in various ways. However, this war caused them to be used widely on both sides and extensively on the Western Front. This was an area around the French and Belgian borders. Long, narrow trenches dug into the ground at the front, usually by the infantry soldiers who would occupy them for weeks at a time, were designed to protect troops from machine gun fire and artillery attack from the air. The war also saw the wide use of chemical warfare, and the trenches were thought to offer some degree of protection against exposure, giving soldiers more time to seek shelter or put on gas masks. So, how were these trenches designed? And why weren't they all just in a straight line? I mean, that's how I would do it.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Well, for one thing, if the trenches were all built in a straight line, then any enemy that managed to reach them and enter them would only need to point their guns in either direction, let off some rounds, and cause a large amount of casualties. Further to that, a well-thrown grenade or artillery shell exploding inside the trench would cause the blast wave and shrapnel to travel its length and inflict damage along the way. So because of this, trench systems were dug in different patterns such as zigzags or even short straight lines with corners. The trenches were mostly dug deep enough into the ground so that the soldiers could stand completely upright. They had timber along the base, known as duck boards, to allow drainage so the soldier didn't have to stand in water and mud. A fire step allowed the soldier to shoot out of the trench. The walls were reinforced with timber to prevent collapse. A parapet, usually made up of sandbags, would be above the trench towards the enemy and allowed more headroom when walking the trenches. At the back were dugouts which provided shelter from enemy artillery or places to rest and sleep when there was a lull in the fighting. Of course, everything I've just explained was the best case scenario. A lot of the time, materials weren't available or the terrain didn't allow it. What is interesting though is that the German trenches were far more superior than the Allied trenches. They often used harder materials such as concrete and had reinforced bunkers and dugouts. This is due to their belief that the war would be a long drawn out one, so they initially built their trenches for this purpose. The trench system itself was made up of 4 types of trenches. A fire trench, the one closest to the enemy. The next one set back was the support trench. And finally, the reserve trench made up the rear. Communication trenches interconnected between the 3. The fire trench is where the defence and assaults on the enemy took place. Soldiers would generally spend a week, maybe even a few days in this position, before rotating with the support trench. The reserve trench was made up of reserve troops and artillerymen. Initially, both sides mounted attacks from the trenches with bayonets fixed to their rifles, climbing over the top into what was known as no man's land. This was the area between both forces. Not surprisingly, this approach was rarely effective and led to mass casualties. Later on in the war, forces would conduct their attacks at night, which allowed more cover. The Germans became quite good at this, and under artillery cover often made it to the Allied trench systems. The brutality and ridiculousness of trench warfare is perhaps best shown on the first day during the Battle of the Somme in France. On the 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 deaths. All of this in a single day. Disease and shell shock were rampant in the trenches, with soldiers fighting in close proximity, usually in unsanitary conditions. Despite the duckboards, in some trenches, torrential rain caused constant exposure to wetness, which in turn caused a thing called trench foot. This is a painful condition in which dead tissue spreads across the feet, often resulting in amputation. As they were effectively trapped in the trenches for long periods of time under nearly constant bombardment, many soldiers suffered from shell shock, or what is known today as post-traumatic stress disorder. It's likely all of these factors and the widespread use of trench warfare caused World War I to be one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. A total of 20 million people died, and 21 million people were wounded. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button, leave a thumbs up and a comment down below telling us your thoughts on World War I trenches.